Good evening. It's always so nice to stand up here and look out at all of you. My name is Arlo Haskell, and I am Executive Director of the Key West Literary Seminar. I want to, first of all, echo Diane in welcoming all of you to Key West. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. I've been around the seminar for a long time. As some of you know, during the early years of our history in the 1980s and 1990s, my mom, Monica Haskell, was director of the program and worked closely with Lynn and David Caulfield, our founders. I remember attending sessions when the seminar was held on Stock Island at the Tennessee Williams Theater. And I remember when it moved downtown here to Duval Street in 1993. Nobel laureate Octavio Paz was the keynote speaker that year. It was 26 years ago, but I remember shaking Octavio's hand in the front lobby, and I remember the sense of reverence that everyone who came here that night paid him. Over the course of 37 years, we've had our share, you might say more than our fair share, of incredible writers take the stage here. But there's something about Margaret Atwood. When we announced this topic from this stage 1 year ago, I stood up here in the morning and read the list of writers who had already agreed to join us. When I got to Margaret Atwood's name, you could feel the excitement in the crowd. It was palpable and audible. There was a little bit of a collective inhalation, a gasp, as excitement ran through the hall. And this excitement continued through registration for the seminar, which sold out in just 2 minutes this year, a year ago. And it's continued through the year when we saw cancellations fall to a fraction of what we would typically expect. Someone just this afternoon at check-in was telling me that they could feel among their friends who are attending the seminar, they could feel a level of interest that was noticeably more intense this year. And she asked me why I thought that was. 2 words, I said, Margaret Atwood. Margaret's extraordinary career as a poet and novelist have garnered her many of the world's most prestigious literary prizes. But there is in her work a radiant force which carries it even to those parts of the public who don't pay attention to literary prizes. She has been rightly praised for predicting or anticipating a future that we now, sometimes regrettably, find ourselves living in. Perhaps what's most disturbing about this is the fact that she's done this, predicted the future, often by a ruthless focus on historical fact. She tells us what's possible in human behavior by paying attention to what humans have always done in the past. This makes her, as a writer, extremely well-suited to our time and well-suited to this year's seminar, in which we'll explore the origins and archetypes that continue to influence our most meaningful work. We had the good grace of Margaret Atwood's company at the 2012 seminar when we explored yet another world, and it is a profound honor to welcome her back to our stage tonight for the 2019 John Hersey Memorial Address. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Atwood.
Good evening. My name is Margaret Atwood, writer at large. Yes, I am still alive. More or less. And I am your keynote for this evening. How may I help you? Don't answer that. I was chosen for this position, as I am sure you know, because I represent the triple moon goddess in her crone avatar, and what more fitting for a seminar focusing on archetypes? Here's a handy tip for telling if a crescent moon is waxing or waning. D is for debutante, C is for crone. Write it down, it never fails. This is just a sample of the pearls of wisdom that moon goddesses, in their crone aspect, are known to bestow. I am very happy to be here once again at the excellent and convivial Key West Literary Seminary to discover that American writers are not yet being sent to the Gulag. And to find that Key West is not yet underwater. Unlike Atlantis, which we will get to in a minute. The general topic of this year's seminar is Under the Influence, Archetype, and Adaptation from Homer to the Multiplex. Revolving behind you is an assemblage I put together while battling the fearsome dragon PowerPoint. Our loathing is mutual, but I wrestled it to the ground, and which contains a sampling of artistic effusions by my younger avatars, as well as by some various book cover designers. I have tossed them in tonight so you will have something to look at while I drone on. Audio visuals being the required up-to-date thing. You're just lucky I didn't make a YouTube. So here comes the audio. Archetype and adaptation from Homer to the Multiplex is highly suggestive. I will try to pay it fitting attention, because I always do what I am told, and it covers a lot of ground, a lot of sea, a lot of air, and a lot of fire and brimstone, just to toss in an archetypal reference right at the beginning. Earth, air, fire, and water are, as you know, the four elements so long held dear by the quasi-scientists, read alchemists, of millennia past, and that are still present in the form of the daily horoscope that I am sure you all consult. 3 earth signs in the zodiac, 3 fire signs, 3 air signs, and 3 water signs, making up the magic number 12. The 12 days of Christmas, 12 for the 12 lunar months, with the disappearing and reappearing 13th. 12 for the sons of Jacob, and thus the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 for the 12 apostles, plus Jesus, the magic 13th. 12 gates to the city of the New Jerusalem. 12 for the number of tales in Tennyson's Arthurian poem cycle, Idylls of the King. 12 for the 12 dwarves in The Hobbit, plus Thorin Oakenshield, the magic 13th. 12 witches in a coven, plus the leader. And 12 for the number of maids hanged by Odysseus at the end of the Odyssey, after he has proven himself the true king by shooting a phallic arrow through the round, moon-shaped holes in, you guessed it, 12, count them, 12 axe heads. A minute having now elapsed, and I having promised you Atlantis in a minute, let's go straight there. Being a person of no shame whatsoever, but of infinite curiosity, I rushed off straight away to see the brand new blockbuster Atlantis super epic Aquaman as soon as it landed. I had a bit of trouble getting someone to go with me. Not everyone in my age group has the same enthusiasm for large hairy men covered with blue and gold scales who can talk to sharks. But once I was there, it was name that influence from beginning to end. Helpful hint to the makers of such films. I am your intended audience. Or one aspect of your intended audience. It is such as I who have the superpower you so desperately need, the ability to supply the ponderous footnotes that will ennoble your enterprise in the minds of the more literarily inclined, raising it from kitschy pop culture to whatever it will now become. Having cut some of our teeth on the comics of the 40s and 50s, oldies such as I know that these golden age epics strip-mined ancient Greek and Roman and even biblical mythology to an alarming extent, because why rack your brains when so many good stories already exist? Thus Wonder Woman and her scantily attired Amazons. Thus Captain Marvel's magic word, Shazam. Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, and Mercury. Atlas? Really? Who would want to be him? Thus the powers that once belonged to gods made flesh, more or less, with many a cape and boot. Odin disguised himself as a mortal to walk among men, and so does Superman, to name but one. We aged footnoters can relate many stories of the unions of gods or goddesses with mortals, a hero-producing enterprise, as our mysterious origins, obscure upbringings, and weird tutors that range from centaurs to Yoda in Star Wars. Aquaman's tutor is not green or four-hooved, but an Atlantean named Vulco. Well, why not? Vulcan is the Roman equivalent of Hephaestus, the Greek god who makes the armor of Achilles. Oh, makers of such movies, you will have to get up very early in the morning to pull a fast one on such as I. Aquaman is birth-named Arthur, in itself portentous. What ho, Camelot! We are therefore not surprised when he turns out to have an evil half-brother, Orm, the Mordred of the tale. True kings can retrieve swords from under heavy stones, like Theseus, or pull them out of stones, like King Arthur. So it is with a smile of recognition that after a quest that outgrails the Grail, replete with riddles and clues and perils galore, as quests should be, we watch Aquaman wrest the golden trident of Atlantis from the dead grip of king whose name we failed to grasp. Yes, I know it's King Atlan, but they mumbled. This golden trident is a tool that, like the sword of King Arthur and the bow of Odysseus, can be wielded only by its true king, rightful claimant. As for that thing guarding the trident, voiced by Julie Andrews, because there's a beast in the old dame yet, its name is the Karathan. Earlier version in Aquaman lore, the Karakan. And from earlier yet, we hear an echo of the legendary Kraken, the monstrous sea creature poeticized by Tennyson in his earlier poem, The Kraken, and sci-fied by John Wyndham in his novel, The Kraken Wakes. The more you delve into the many, many earlier versions of the Aquaman story, he is to be a blonde, just for instance, you realize that the world of superhero narratives operates quite a lot like the world of oral mythology. There are many different versions of the Odysseus and Penelope story, and of every other Homeric story that existed before somebody or somebodies wrote down one version, thus setting that version in stone. Was Penelope the chaste and overly tearful wife portrayed in the Odyssey? Or did she, as some said, sleep with one or all of the suitors? Was Iphigenia sacrificed to a god by her father Agamemnon, as Jephthah's daughter was in the Bible, or was she spirited away to become a priestess among the Taurians? Compare this story with that of Isaac, who was about to have his throat slit by his dad. Well, he was a teenager. You can see how it might happen. when God substituted a sheep? And what about Helen of Troy? Some say that she spent the whole Trojan War in Egypt and that the Helen who appeared at Troy was made of clouds. The tracing of influence is endless once you start. But when did we start? Stories have been morphing into other stories for as long as there have been stories. Swan Lake is familiar to you as the ballet of that name, but practically the same story was told in the epic poetry of the Haida, a language group of one resident on a large island archipelago off the northwest coast of Canada, except that the bird maiden in question is a goose. My favorite animal woman bride story comes from China, however. The bride is similarly beautiful and beloved, but her other form is a snail who lives in the water barrel outside the door. And one of the oldest stories of all is Cinderella, except that the shoe in question is not made of glass. The story is so old that it precedes glass. Instead, the slipper is made of fur, as it would have been once. In the age of oral storytelling, stories did not travel from book to mind to hand to book. Instead, they traveled from mouth to ear to mouth. For such storytelling, the audience was always present and would throw vegetables at you if they didn't like the way it was going. But for stories told in books, the audience is always at least one remove away from the teller in time and space. Here is an anecdote about how stories, traveling from one teller to another, can morph into something rich and strange. In a book called Sheba, Through the Desert in Search of the Legendary Queen, author Nicholas Clapp describes how he hangs out with nomadic desert tribes people. At night, with no electricity, they are in the habit of sitting around the fire and telling stories, as human beings no doubt did for at least 50,000 years, if not more. One of these desert stories was about a doomed love affair that strangely resembled Romeo and Juliet. In fact, it was Romeo and Juliet, but in it there was another figure, a royal sheikh called Sheikh Spahir. Say that fast, and you will realize that this is none other than Shakespeare. Yes, Shakespeare has become a character in one of his own plays. And in the world of storytelling, so it goes. Stories bend, change, cannibalize other stories, borrow, and steal. The Romantic era of fetishization of genius-like absolute originality is very new, and also, for the most part, spurious. Chaucer, for one, is always talking about his authority, the person he got the story from, the one that he is now retelling. I just make shit up, goes a writer-related T-shirt slogan. Chaucer would have been horrified to have it said of him that he just made shit up. No way. His stories were the real deal, and the good housekeeping seal of approval for their real dealness was the fact that he filched them from some other storyteller more ancient than he. Never mind that he ascribes his tale of Troilus and Cressida to someone called Lollius, who has never been definitively identified. Was this Lollius really Boccaccio? Let's arm wrestle for it, as scholars have been doing for some time. Point being, if you can think it up, Mr. Romantic Genius Poet of the 19th century, I say Mr. because Ms. Romantic Genius of the 19th century was unlikely to have been called such, crazy, weird, pseudo-writer lunatic being more likely. If you can think it up, Mr. Romantic Genius Poet of the 19th century, someone else has probably told it. or told something very similar. "Oh, Aquaman, how come you can talk to fish?" "Because that's a thing that heroes and true kings can do, you ninny." "Don't you know nothing? Some of them talk to ants. Get a grip." I will now tell you 3 stories about 3 stories I have told, or in this case, written: The Handmaid's Tale, the Penelopiad, and Hag Seed. But first, a little bit about how I got my magic tickle trunk full of rags and bones and odds and ends that we are sometimes pleased to refer to as my influences. Once upon a time, long, long ago, before you were born. I used to say that as a joke, but it is increasingly not very funny. There was no internet. There were also no pantyhoses, no lattes, at least not around here, no smartphones, no social media, and no streamed television series. And no television, come to that. There were movies, but not many for children. There was the theater, but not much for children. People read books. I read books. I read a lot of books, not just comic books. I read the usual kids' adventure stories, but also a lot of murder mysteries, and in the 50s, a lot of Golden Age sci-fi, thus Orwell, Huxley, Bradbury, John Wyndham, and lesser writers, including whoever wrote Donovan's Brain, the plot of which I will be pleased to recite to you if requested, as it is the only book in which French symbolist poetry plays a heroic role in the action. Toss in some borderline cases such as Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Turn of the Screw, the first 2 of which might not exactly be sci-fi, but might sort of be maybe, plus the collected works of H.G. Wells, which I went through when supposed to be doing my homework. I also read the Bible due to Canada's peculiar educational system. That did not separate church and state, but had 2 publicly funded systems, the Protestant and the Catholic. I was of an age in which we studied 1 or 2 Shakespeare plays a year, and due to the fact that I took Latin in high school, a prerequisite for the honors English 4-year course in which I was shortly to enroll, I read the Iliad and the Odyssey when I was more or less 16. And the Aeneid, of course. Translations were handy, needless to say. I have always had a great respect for translators. It's often a thankless job, but it should be thanked, so I will do that now. Thank you, translators. You have helped me appear so much smarter than I am. Add to that collection the complete Grimm's fairy tales in the age before Disney took out the red-hot shoes and pecked out eyeballs, Norse mythology, a doer business altogether, and the 1001 Nights and One Night, and Gulliver's Travels, and you've got a pretty good toolbox for a yarn spinner. And so I began to spin. I now found myself, as a budding writer at the age of 19, living in what we might term the age of mythology. Robert Graves's White Goddess was hot stuff, though discouraging to poetically inclined young female people such as myself, since it proposed that I become the incarnation of the triple moon goddess and murder the Ear King, replacing him with his substitute or double, the Set to his Osiris. I wonder what kind of early dating experiences Robert Graves had undergone. I wasn't much inclined to do this boyfriend murdering thing, but I needn't have worried. Others would credit me with these propensities, whether I liked it or not, and the Medusa hair didn't help matters much. Wasn't it enough that John Milton went on about Eve's wanton curls in Paradise Lost? No, it was not. Snakes and freezing glares must be added. Well, at least I wasn't a pushover. Don't underestimate this. If you have a choice between pushover and scary witch-like supernatural female, take the latter. As you can see, I am still standing. Graves was one thing, Northrop Frye was another. Mythology was his game, and so were archetypes, and he taught at my college, at the University of Toronto. Yippee! I already knew the texts. Being the Medusa type of person already mentioned, I of course made fun of just about everything, including archetypes. I am sorry to say that under a collective pen name called Shakespeare Latweed, I did an archetypal analysis of the Ajax kitchen cleanser singing commercial. You know the one, or maybe you do. Use Ajax, bum bum, the foaming cleanser, wash the dirt right down the sink, drain. Wash the dirt right down the drain, bum 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 bum. The archetype of the dirt was being fought to a standstill in this saga. What could be more Homeric? Ajax was chosen because of his strength, of course, but there's a subtext. Ajax goes insane. Maybe that's where the foaming comes in. Anyway, myths were everywhere in those days. Leonard Cohen's second book of poems was called Let Us Compare Mythologies. And that is what young writers were doing, comparing mythologies, and now it seems the archetype is making a comeback. Witness the Key West Literary Seminar. If the Key West Literary Seminar is doing it, can the rest of the world be far behind? So much for the deep background. Now for the 3 examples from my written yarn spinning that I promised you a while back. I'll do them in reverse chronological order. First, Hag Seed, published in 2016. This was written as part of the Hogarth Shakespeare Project, in which modern novelists were tasked with choosing a play of Shakespeare's and redoing it as a modern novel. Luckily, I was asked early on because I bagged The Tempest, the only one I would have wanted to tackle. We modern novelists were given the utmost latitude. We could supply modern elements corresponding to each element in the original play, as Jeanette Winterson ingeniously did in her redo of A Winter's Tale, or you could toy with just a few of the elements, as Howard Jacobson did with The Merchant of Venice. I chose the first road, which posed many a challenge: how to create a modern version of Prospero's Island, on which he lives with his daughter Miranda, who has never seen any men except him and the intriguingly problematical Caliban. An island wouldn't do, not in the age of airplanes and Google mapping. And any other form of isolation, such as a condo, would make Prospero into a weird old perv, or so it seemed to me, since he would have had to deny Miranda access to any form of internet, television, or social media. The horror. The solutions I came up with are in the book, but I will pause briefly to remark upon magic islands. The tradition that islands are likely to be magic goes back at least to our very old friend, the Odyssey, in which Odysseus visits the island of the dead, pours a trench full of blood, and talks with some folks no longer in a living condition. Also the island of Circe the enchantress, who turns piggy men into pigs, and also the island of Calypso, the singing seductress, who kept Odysseus for 7 years, so much against his will. She made me do it. While trying to persuade him to stay there forever. There are other islands too, that of the Sirens, of Polyphemus, the one-eyed giant, of the Lotus Eaters, each one containing weirdness, adventures, and peril. Think of a giant video game in which each of the islands is an obstacle that must be overcome before Odysseus can reach his homeland, which is also an island. Islands can be magical in really bad ways, as is the island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Or they can be magical in mostly a good way, as Prospero's musical and aerial-controlled island is. But they can also be prisons if you don't have a boat and can't get off them, as Prospero's island also is. In a play that contains so many imprisonments, everyone in the play is imprisoned at one time or another, the island is Prospero's second biggest prison. The biggest prison is revealed at the end of the play, in the epilogue, spoken by Prospero. The biggest island is the play itself. Unless the audience uses its own magic power, the power of applause, Prospero will be trapped inside the play and on the island forever. Hopping from one island to another takes us to Ithaca, home base of Odysseus, and to the setting of the Penelopiad, published in 2005. This slim volume, slim by specification, as there was a word-length requirement, was written in answer to a cri de coeur by Jamie Byng, publisher of Canongate, who, along with a Canadian publisher, an American publisher, and a German publisher, and after one suspects a few drops taken at the Frankfurt Book Fair, a veritable pressure cooker of bizarre publishing schemes, cooked up an international mythology idea. A number of susceptible authors would be asked to choose a myth, any myth, and retell it any way they wanted within the set word limit. I was made party to this caper when Jamie Byng leapt out from behind a potted plant in Edinburgh while I was having breakfast. But this is crucial, before any coffee had been drunk by me. In that foggy state, I fell easy prey to his blandishments and promised to write one of these things. But which myth? My first idea was to retell the Haida myth of Mouse Woman. No. A very small but helpful Haida god from the West Coast. But then I realized that few would be familiar with the original myth, which would defeat the purpose, since such interplays depend on knowledge of the story. Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, told from the point of view of Mr. Rochester's mad wife, makes much less sense if you don't know Jane Eyre, in which she so notably first appears. So I abandoned Mouse Woman, and then I was at a loss. I even went so far as to call my UK agent and propose that I abandon the project. Do you think Jamie Byng would mind very much if I didn't do the myth book? I asked timorously. There was an icy pause. Well, of course you must do as you wish, came a severe voice in Mary Poppins nanny tones. But Jamie Byng will be gutted. Alarmed, I realized that I must avoid gutting Jamie. But what to do? Then out of the mists of deep, dark time, help came to my aid. Back in the 1950s, when I was reading our old friend, the Odyssey, I had been distressed by several things. How much crying Penelope had done, really quite a lot. And she couldn't have cried all the time because somebody had to be running that place. And it had to be her. There's no other choice. But also, and especially, the hanging of the 12 maid slaves at the end. It did not seem to me then, and it does not seem to me now, that they deserved such a fate. And as I read and reread the text in preparation, that view was borne out. This was not about any acts these girls had committed. It was an honor killing. As for Odysseus claiming to be able to interpret Penelope's upsetting dream of her favorite white geese being slaughtered, I took that as just one more sign of him hogging the stage. If the geese were the suitors, why were they beloved in the dream, and why was Penelope so upset by their deaths? What if instead the geese were the doomed slave maids? So Penelope would get to tell her own story, I determined. The storytelling in the Odyssey is done 90% by Odysseus, a noteworthy liar. And the maids would act as the Greek chorus and get a word or two or several hundred words in of their own. And so it was. Who tells the story and to whom has always had a lot to do with what kind of story it is. Which brings it to my third example, The Handmaid's Tale of 1985-6. The title is partly an homage to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and partly a biblical quotation. In this title, only the word "the" is not a specific allusion. And so it is in the text, as I was determined not to just make shit up. In The Handmaid's Tale, the underpinnings for the details of the regime described are taken, each and every one, from history itself. This novel has been made into a film, an opera, a ballet, a beautiful illustrated version from Folio Press, an iconic protest costume, and a celebrated television series now shooting its third season. It's frequently cited in election commentaries, as in, just like The Handmaid's Tale, and on banners held by marches, as in, The Handmaid's Tale is not a blueprint, and perhaps more famously, make Margaret Atwood fiction again. It's a little disturbing. It's sort of like Shakespeare turning up in Romeo and Juliet. Apparently, I have been fiction once and could be so again. Who would have anticipated all this? Not myself at the time I was writing. My expectations were modest. I thought of it as a book that might annoy some people and please others, happily more of the second than of the first. As a literary form, The Handmaid's Tale is a dystopia, a novel about a freedom-restricting society. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, dystopias of many kinds are thick on the ground for reasons that must have to do with our anxieties about the future of our planet, as well as about our social future. And authoritarian governments have arisen in many places for various reasons, though they do share one feature: the rollback of women's rights. In the early 1980s, there was already a stream of talk in the United States about implementing something like a dictatorship of the religious right, with an emphasis on the subordination of women. A return to the roots? Puritan New England was not a democracy. It was a theocracy. And it was so hard on women that of the women stolen away by Native North Americans, the majority didn't want to go back to Puritan New England, whereas the majority of stolen men did want to go back to Puritan New England. What does that tell you? When I wrote The Handmaid's Tale, dystopias, apart from stories set on other planets, were not much in evidence. But as you've heard, the form has always interested me. When I began writing The Handmaid's Tale in the spring of 1984, I was living in West Berlin. The Iron Curtain was still up, giving me a first-hand view of life in a totalitarianism. I had also visited Iran and Afghanistan not long before, countries where the subjugation of women was highly visible. But the West did not have to look back very far into its own past to find a state of affairs in which most women were barred from higher education, property ownership, and the right to their own children. The details in The Handmaid's Tale don't come from far away and long ago. They are possibilities within every society, including ours. I'm often asked what my hope is for this book. In fact, it's the same hope it's always been. I hope that The Handmaid's Tale will remain between its covers, that it will not become a reality here and now any more than it already is. Thank you.